June 1944, the Western Pacific just after midnight. The ocean is black and seemingly empty, its surface broken only by the faint phosphorescence of wake trails fading behind Japanese warships. On the bridges of cruisers and destroyers, naval officers speak quietly. Night has always been their ally. Darkness conceals movement. Darkness protects fleets from air attack, or at least it always has. There is no moon. No searchlights cut the sky. No engines are visible overhead. Then radar operators aboard American carriers detect shapes where no eyes can see. Blips appear on circular screens, small, precise, unmistakable. Vectors are calculated, orders are given calmly. Fighters already airborne begin to turn. Minutes later, Japanese lookouts hear engines before they see anything at all. Out of complete darkness, American aircraft descend with terrifying accuracy. Flares are unnecessary, searchlights are irrelevant. Gunfire erupts from nowhere. Ships maneuver blindly as bombs and cannon fire strike with precision that should be impossible at night. On Japanese bridges, disbelief spreads faster than alarms. This was not chance. And it was not luck. For the first time in the Pacific War, darkness itself had failed. And in that moment, Japanese naval officers realized something had fundamentally changed at sea. When war broke out in the Pacific in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy entered the conflict with a deep and justified confidence in its night fighting ability. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized operations after sunset. Crews trained extensively to maneuver, communicate, and strike in darkness. Optical spotting, disciplined formation keeping, and coordinated night attacks were considered national strengths. This belief was not theoretical. It had been proven. During the early months of the war, Japanese forces routinely used darkness to devastating effect. In the waters around the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and later the Solomon Islands, Japanese destroyers and cruisers launched surprise night attacks that overwhelmed Allied forces. The most infamous example came in August 1942 at the Battle of Savo Island, where a Japanese task force annihilated an Allied cruiser screen in minutes under cover of night. Allied commanders were stunned by how completely they had been outmatched after dark. For Japan, night was not simply a time of reduced visibility. It was a tactical environment they believed they controlled. This confidence rested on several assumptions. Japanese officers trusted human eyesight, binoculars, and disciplined lookouts more than emerging electronic systems. Optical rangefinders were considered reliable. Crews were trained to detect silhouettes, smoke, and reflections that untrained eyes would miss. Darkness, in Japanese doctrine, favored skill and experience over machines. Radar existed, but it was not central. Japan did deploy some radar systems during the war, but early models were limited in range, resolution, and reliability. More importantly, radar was not fully integrated into command doctrine. Information from radar was often treated as supplementary rather than decisive. Visual confirmation remained paramount. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy was learning a different lesson. In the shock of Pearl Harbor, American planners confronted the reality that traditional warning systems had failed. Radar sets had detected incoming aircraft that morning, but the information had not been properly interpreted or acted upon. The failure was not technological, it was organizational. From that moment forward, American leadership treated radar not as an experiment, but as a necessity. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the United States poured resources into radar development at a scale Japan could not match. Shipborne radar improved rapidly, transforming naval combat during the night battles off Guadalcanal. American destroyers and cruisers began using radar fire control to engage targets before they were visible. The balance of night combat at sea started to shift. But aircraft remained a problem. Night air combat was still dangerous and imprecise. Pilots struggled to locate enemy aircraft or ships in darkness, even when guided toward general positions. Without a visual target, interception was unreliable. Darkness still offered protection, especially over open ocean. That protection would not last. By 1943, American engineers began mounting airborne interception radar directly into fighters. These compact systems allowed pilots to detect aircraft or ships ahead of them, regardless of light conditions. The radar operator, sometimes the pilot alone, sometimes assisted by additional crew, could guide the aircraft toward a target using nothing but electronic signals. This was not merely a new weapon. It was a new way of seeing. Carrier decks began launching night fighter squadrons trained specifically for radar-guided interception. Aircraft like the F-6 F-5N Hellcat and F-4U-2 Corsair carried radar pods that transformed darkness into navigable space. Pilots no longer depended on moonlight or flares, they depended on screens and vectors. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, continued to assume that night remained a protective veil. Their fleets still moved after sunset. Supply runs still relied on darkness. Escorts still trusted that unseen skis were safe skis. By mid-1944, these assumptions were dangerously outdated. The Pacific had become an electronic battlefield. And the first true confrontation between old doctrine and new technology was about to occur, silently, invisibly, in skis where human eyes no longer mattered. By early 1944, the technological gap between the two navies was no longer subtle, it was systemic. American radar development had moved beyond detection and into integration. Radar was no longer a separate instrument reporting to commanders, it was embedded into how the U.S. Navy fought. Information flowed from ship to ship, from carrier to fighter, from radar operator to pilot in near real time. Darkness, weather, and distance were no longer barriers, they were variables to be calculated. At the center of this transformation was airborne interception radar, known as AI radar. Compact enough to fit inside a fighter aircraft, these systems could detect targets miles ahead, displaying their relative position on a small circular screen. Early versions were crude, but by 1944 they had become reliable enough to guide pilots directly to enemy aircraft or ships without visual contact. This capability reshaped carrier warfare. American carriers began operating night combat air patrols, something previously considered too dangerous and complex. Specially trained squadrons flew after sunset, guided by radar controllers aboard ships who tracked enemy movements beyond the horizon. When contacts appeared, fighters were vectored precisely toward them, descending out of darkness with no warning. Aircraft like the F-6 F-5N Hellcat became central to this effort. Equipped with radar pods mounted under the wing, these fighters could detect targets in total darkness. The F-4U-2 Corsair, modified for night operations, followed closely behind. Later in the war, land-based aircraft such as the P-61 Black Widow extended this capability even further, especially around island airfields and fleet anchorages. Training mattered as much as equipment. Night fighter pilots underwent rigorous preparation. They learned to trust instruments over instinct, to fly by numbers rather than sight. Radar operators practiced interpreting faint returns that might represent an aircraft, a ship, or even sea clutter. Coordination between pilot, controller, and carrier became a discipline in itself. The Japanese Navy lacked an equivalent system. Japan did develop airborne and ship-based radar during the war, but production numbers were limited, and performance lagged behind Allied systems. More critically, radar was never fully woven into Japanese doctrine. Information delays, skepticism among senior officers, and shortages of trained personnel prevented effective integration. As a result, Japanese naval operations continued to rely heavily on traditional assumptions. Night still meant concealment. Black seas still meant safety. Escorts remained alert for visual threats, not electronic ones. Ships maneuvered under the belief that unseen skis were empty skis. This mismatch became increasingly dangerous as American forces advanced across the Pacific. By mid-1944, U.S. carrier task forces were operating closer to Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Night raids, once rare, became routine. Supply convoys, reinforcement movements, and fleet repositioning all faced a new threat, one that could not be seen or heard until it was too late. Japanese intelligence reports began to note unusual patterns. Ships were attacked at night with unexpected accuracy. Aircraft appeared without warning. Losses occurred under conditions that should have provided safety. Explanations varied, but the underlying cause was not yet fully acknowledged. Darkness was no longer neutral. It favored the side that could see without light. This realization would not come from theory or analysis alone. It would arrive through experience, through sudden encounters at sea, where Japanese officers would confront the unsettling truth that technology had quietly rewritten the rules of night warfare. Those encounters were imminent. And when they occurred, they would unfold not in daylight battles remembered by history books, but in brief, violent moments hidden by darkness, moments that would permanently alter how the Imperial Japanese Navy understood the night. The shock experienced by Japanese naval officers during these encounters did not stem from a single failure or surprise. It emerged from several angles at once: technological, human, and doctrinal, colliding in the darkness over the Pacific. Radar-guided night fighters represented a quiet revolution. Unlike traditional weapons that announced their presence through sound or fire, radar worked invisibly. It denied the enemy not just concealment but certainty. For Japanese officers accustomed to reading the sea by eye, this was deeply unsettling. A fleet could maintain strict radio silence, extinguish all lights, and maneuver carefully, yet still be found. American fighters did not need moonlight or flares, they needed only a return signal on a screen. This shifted the balance of night warfare from skill-based concealment to system-based detection. The advantage no longer belonged to the side with sharper eyesight or better discipline, but to the side with superior electronics and coordination. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, whose doctrine prized night action, this represented a direct erosion of a core strength. Inside American cockpits, night interception was an exercise in restraint and trust. Pilots flew into darkness with limited visual reference, relying almost entirely on instruments. The radar screen became their horizon. A steady blip replaced the outline of an enemy aircraft. These pilots were not chasing targets they could see. They were following instructions from unseen controllers, making calculated turns and descents guided by numbers rather than instinct. When visual contact finally occurred, often at close range, it came suddenly and decisively. For Japanese crews, the experience was disorienting. Lookouts scanned empty skies. Gunners waited for targets that never appeared until fire erupted from nowhere. There was no warning, no gradual escalation, only impact. Reports from survivors often described confusion rather than fear. The attacks did not follow patterns they recognized. Traditional explanations failed. Darkness had betrayed them. Japanese naval officers initially struggled to explain these encounters. Some believed the Americans were using flares unseen from certain angles. Others suspected chance sutungs or coincidence. Few immediately grasped the role of airborne radar. This hesitation mattered. Because the threat was invisible, countermeasures were unclear. There was no obvious system to jam, no light source to extinguish, no formation to tighten. The very nature of radar made it difficult to conceptualize for officers trained in visual warfare. As losses mounted, disbelief turned into uneasy recognition. The enemy was not guessing, he was seeing. Japanese doctrine had long emphasized decisive night action. Destroyer squadrons practiced torpedo attacks under cover of darkness. Fleets maneuvered at night to avoid air attack. This approach had served Japan well early in the war. Radar-guided fighters dismantled that doctrine without confronting it directly. Night no longer guaranteed safety from air attack. Movement after sunset invited interception. The old rhythm of day and night operations collapsed. Darkness became dangerous rather than protective. This forced Japanese commanders into uncomfortable choices: move by day and face overwhelming Allied air power, or move by night and risk unseen attackers. Neither option offered safety. The psychological weight of this dilemma was heavy. Officers trained for night mastery now faced a world where night itself belonged to the enemy. By the time this reality was fully acknowledged, American radar-guided fighters had already established control over the darkness. The shock was not simply technological, it was existential. The night, once Japan's ally, had changed sides. And the consequences of that shift were about to be felt across the Pacific, as isolated encounters turned into a sustained pattern of dominance that no doctrine could easily reverse. As radar-guided interceptions became more frequent, their impact spread beyond individual encounters. What began as tactical surprise evolved into strategic pressure, reshaping leadership decisions, naval doctrine, and morale within the Imperial Japanese Navy. For Japanese senior officers, the emergence of effective American night air control created a crisis of interpretation. Reports arriving from the fleet described attacks that defied established understanding. Ships were struck without warning. Aircraft failed to return from routine night operations. Escorts reported no visual contact before engagement. At first, these incidents were treated as anomalies. Commanders attributed losses to chance or isolated failures of lookout discipline. Admitting a fundamental flaw in doctrine was difficult, especially when that doctrine had delivered early victories. Gradually, patterns became impossible to ignore. Losses clustered around night movements. Fleets attempting to reposition after sunset suffered disproportionate damage. Commanders began restricting night operations, but these measures conflicted with long-standing operational habits. Orders became cautious, then contradictory. Initiative narrowed. American commanders, by contrast, grew more confident. Radar coverage extended outward from carrier task forces. Night fighter patrols increased. The darkness became a controlled environment rather than a risk. For Japanese crews, the psychological effect was profound. Sailors accustomed to trusting the night now faced uncertainty every time the sun set. Darkness no longer promised concealment, it threatened sudden destruction. This uncertainty eroded morale. Crews remained tense through long nights, scanning skies that offered no warning. Sleep became fragmented, confidence declined. The sense of mastery that once defined Japanese naval night operations faded. American pilots experienced the opposite effect. Night operations once feared became routine. Success bred familiarity, familiarity bred dominance. Darkness no longer represented danger, it represented opportunity. The psychological balance of night warfare had inverted. Strategically, radar-guided night control compressed Japanese operational space. Supply movements slowed, reinforcements were delayed, fleets hesitated to maneuver freely. The Pacific became smaller for Japan even as American reach expanded. This shift proved decisive during late-war operations. At Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, Japanese movements were increasingly predictable, constrained by fear of unseen interception. Radar-guided fighters did not win these battles alone, but they removed options before battles even began. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a reality it could not reverse. Darkness, once a shield, had become a liability. Technology had not simply countered doctrine, it had rendered it obsolete. This realization set the stage for a series of encounters where radar-guided fighters would demonstrate, beyond doubt, that the night itself now belonged to the Allies. Those encounters would form the decisive turning point when disbelief gave way to acceptance and acceptance to strategic defeat. The turning point did not arrive with a single battle announcement or a dramatic communique. It emerged quietly through a sequence of night encounters that followed the same unsettling pattern, each one reinforcing the last. In mid-1944, as American carrier task forces pushed westward across the Pacific, radar-guided night fighters became a constant presence. Japanese ships attempting to reposition after sunset were no longer moving through empty darkness. They were moving through monitored space. One of the clearest demonstrations came during night operations around the Philippine Sea and the approaches to the Marianas. Japanese aircraft sent to probe or harass Allied fleets at night began failing to return. Survivors reported being intercepted without warning, engaged by fighters that appeared suddenly, already in firing position. From the Japanese perspective, this was deeply disorienting. There were no flares illuminating the sky. No searchlights sweeping the horizon. No gradual buildup of sound or light. American night fighters were being guided directly to targets by radar controllers aboard carriers. Pilots followed vectors precisely, descending from altitude until visual contact occurred at close range, often only seconds before firing. By the time Japanese crews realized they were under attack, it was already over. Naval officers aboard Japanese ships struggled to explain how these interceptions were possible. Reports noted that American fighters seemed to know exact positions and altitudes. Traditional countermeasures, evasive maneuvers, radio silence, darkness, had no effect. The shock deepened as these encounters multiplied. At sea, Japanese destroyers and cruisers moving at night came under sudden air attack. Bombs and strafing runs struck with accuracy inconsistent with chance sightings. Damage reports began to include a troubling phrase, "Enemy aircraft located us in complete darkness." For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this represented more than tactical loss. It signaled the collapse of a foundational assumption that night separated fleets from air power. American commanders recognized the significance immediately. Radar-guided night fighters were no longer experimental assets. They were force multipliers. Darkness had become an extension of carrier air control. As a result, night patrols intensified. Fighter directors aboard carriers coordinated interceptions with growing confidence. Radar coverage overlapped. The Pacific sky, once vast and opaque, became mapped and predictable, at least for one side. Japanese leadership began receiving consistent, corroborated reports. Losses were no longer isolated. Patterns were clear. The enemy was operating freely at night with precision and coordination Japan could not match. Attempts to adapt followed, but they lagged behind reality. Radar equipment was scarce. Training was limited. Even when radar sets were available, integrating them into doctrine proved slow and contentious. Darkness had already been claimed. By late summer 1944, the implication was unavoidable. Night was no longer a refuge. It was contested and increasingly controlled by American technology. The decisive shift was not marked by a single engagement, but by the moment Japanese commanders accepted that concealment no longer existed after sunset. The Pacific night, once trusted, had become hostile territory. And with that realization, the strategic balance tilted irreversibly. What followed would confirm this change beyond doubt, when radar-guided dominance shaped the largest naval engagements of the war and removed the final illusions surrounding darkness at sea. By late 1944, the evidence had accumulated beyond denial. Radar-guided night control was no longer an emerging capability. It was an established fact shaping every major naval decision in the Pacific. During the opening phases of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese commanders faced a dilemma unlike any before. Fleet movements that once relied on darkness now risked interception. Attempts to reposition forces after sunset were shadowed by radar contacts that could not be shaken. American carriers maintained night patrols that extended their reach far beyond visual range. Japanese naval officers began altering movement schedules, delaying transits or compressing operations into daylight hours despite overwhelming Allied air superiority. The night, once safer than day, had become equally dangerous, if not more so. Radar-guided fighters enforced this reality relentlessly. Night after night, American aircraft intercepted Japanese reconnaissance planes before they could report positions. Bombers approaching under cover of darkness were broken up. Surface ships attempting to maneuver unseen were detected, harassed, and sometimes struck outright. Even when attacks caused limited physical damage, they inflicted strategic paralysis. Commanders could no longer assume freedom of movement. At Okinawa in 1945, the full weight of this transformation became visible. Japanese air operations, particularly kamikaze attacks, relied on timing, surprise, and saturation. Radar-guided night fighters disrupted these elements systematically. Interceptions occurred far from the fleet. Attacks arrived fragmented rather than coordinated. Japanese officers acknowledged the shift in internal assessments. Reports noted that American fighters operated freely at night, guided by electronic detection beyond visual range. Darkness no longer reduced Allied effectiveness, it enhanced it. This realization marked the true turning point. For the first time in naval history, night ceased to be a natural equalizer. Technological systems had erased the advantage that darkness once provided weaker or outmatched forces. Control of the electromagnetic spectrum now mattered as much as control of the sea itself. American commanders exploited this relentlessly. Radar coverage tightened. Night patrols extended farther. The Pacific became a layered battlespace, surface, air, and electronic, dominated by a system Japan could neither replicate nor counter. Japanese naval leadership recognized the implication with growing clarity and diminishing options. Traditional doctrine offered no answer. Training pipelines could not adapt in time. Production could not match scale. Even understanding the threat fully came too late. Darkness had been weaponized. And once weaponized, it could not be taken back. The moment of disbelief, when officers first questioned how they were being found, had evolved into acceptance of an irreversible disadvantage. From that point forward, Japanese naval strategy operated under constraint rather than initiative. The night no longer concealed intent. It exposed vulnerability. And as the war moved toward its final phase, the consequences of that exposure would shape not just individual engagements, but the ultimate collapse of Japan's ability to contest the Pacific at sea. Once radar-guided night control became an accepted reality, its consequences unfolded steadily and relentlessly. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to function. Instead, its operational freedom narrowed day by day, night by night. The most immediate effect was constraint. Japanese fleet movements slowed. Supply convoys altered routes or waited for daylight, only to face American air superiority. Attempts to exploit darkness for repositioning or reinforcement became increasingly rare. Where night had once expanded options, it now removed them. This change carried measurable cost. Japanese ships spent more time idle, burning fuel without advancing strategic objectives. Escort formations grew tighter, reducing flexibility. Reconnaissance flights diminished as losses mounted. The flow of information to Japanese commanders weakened while American situational awareness expanded. Radar-guided fighters played a quiet but decisive role in this imbalance. By intercepting reconnaissance aircraft and harassing surface movements at night, they blinded Japanese command structures. Decisions were made with outdated or incomplete data. Initiatives slipped away. The human toll followed. Japanese aircrews flying night missions faced rising odds of interception. Survivors reported engagements that offered no warning, no visual cue, no time to react. Losses accumulated faster than training pipelines could replace them. Experience drained away. Morale suffered accordingly. Sailors and airmen no longer trusted darkness. Watches grew tense. Sleep came fitfully. The constant expectation of unseen attack wore down crews already strained by prolonged combat and dwindling resources. Confidence, once a hallmark of Japanese night operations, eroded into apprehension. American forces experienced the opposite effect. Night patrols became routine. Radar-guided interception shifted from novelty to standard procedure. Pilots gained confidence in instruments and coordination. Controllers refined vectoring techniques. Each successful interception reinforced the sense that the night belonged to them. This asymmetry shaped later operations profoundly. During the final phases of the Pacific Campaign, Japanese movements became increasingly predictable. Limited options forced commanders into patterns that American intelligence could anticipate and counter. Radar-guided control did not win battles alone, but it removed uncertainty, and in war, uncertainty is often the defender's last advantage. Post-war assessments would later highlight this shift. Japanese officers acknowledged that American radar systems nullified traditional night tactics. Darkness, once considered an ally, had become a vulnerability exploited systematically. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was decisive. By stripping Japan of freedom of movement after sunset, radar-guided fighters shortened the war's final phase and reduced Japan's ability to resist effectively. The loss of the night accelerated the erosion of strategic capacity. And as these consequences accumulated, a broader realization began to take shape, one that extended beyond Japan or the Pacific. The war had revealed something fundamental about modern conflict. Control was no longer defined solely by what could be seen. It was defined by what could be detected. By the final year of the war, the loss of night as a protective domain had become irreversible for Japan. What radar-guided fighters had begun, the broader Allied system of detection, coordination, and interception now completed. At Okinawa, the consequences were unmistakable. Japanese air operations relied increasingly on desperate measures. Kamikaze attacks, designed to overwhelm defenses through surprise and numbers, faced an environment where surprise was steadily eroded. Radar-guided fighters intercepted attackers far from the fleet, breaking formations and forcing individual aircraft to approach alone. Even partial disruption reduced effectiveness dramatically. Japanese naval officers understood the implication. The night no longer offered concealment for approach, regrouping, or withdrawal. Every movement risked detection, every delay compounded vulnerability. The operational space in which Japan could maneuver shrank steadily. Internal assessments reflected a sobering conclusion. Japanese commanders noted that American radar systems allowed continuous pressure without visible presence. Fleets were shadowed electronically. Airspace was monitored invisibly. The psychological weight of constant detection proved as damaging as physical losses. Command decisions became reactive rather than deliberate. This erosion extended beyond combat units. Training suffered as experienced crews were lost faster than replacements could be prepared. Radar countermeasures remained limited. Industrial capacity could not match Allied output. Even when Japanese engineers understood the problem, solving it lay beyond reach. American forces, meanwhile, refined their advantage. Radar coverage expanded. Night operations became integrated into every level of planning. Darkness no longer marked a pause in combat activity. It marked continuity. The tempo of war increased, compressing Japanese response time and accelerating exhaustion. By the time the Pacific War entered its final months, the strategic picture was clear. Japan no longer contested control of the night, it endured it. Post-war reflections by Japanese officers would later acknowledge this shift openly. Radar, they noted, removed uncertainty, the very element upon which night tactics depended. Without uncertainty, traditional skills lost relevance. The implications extended far beyond Japan's defeat. World War II marked the end of an era in which darkness reliably shielded movement and intent. Radar transformed night from a neutral condition into a contested domain. The side that mastered detection controlled not only space, but time, choosing when and where engagements occurred. The Pacific War became one of the first conflicts where electronic dominance shaped outcomes as decisively as firepower. Radar-guided fighters were among the clearest expressions of that change. As Japanese resistance collapsed, the lesson endured. The loss of the night was not merely a tactical failure. It was a strategic turning point that reshaped naval warfare permanently. And with that realization, the story reaches its final reflection, one that looks beyond battles and technologies to consider what was truly lost when darkness stopped offering protection. For centuries, darkness had shaped the rhythm of war at sea. Night concealed movement, softened disadvantages, and gave smaller or outmatched forces a chance to act unseen. Commanders learned to wait for sunset, trusting that human limits, eyes, distance, weather would protect what daylight exposed. In the Pacific War, that understanding quietly ended. Radar did not announce itself with explosions or dramatic victories. It worked in silence. It replaced uncertainty with information and instinct with measurement. When American fighters began finding targets in complete darkness, the night lost its meaning as a shield. It became simply another environment mapped, monitored, and controlled. For Japanese naval officers, the shock was not only technological, it was philosophical. A tradition built on discipline, eyesight, and experience had been overtaken by systems that required none of those things to function. Darkness no longer rewarded skill alone. It rewarded integration, coordination, and industrial depth. This shift reshaped warfare far beyond the Pacific. Radar-guided control marked the beginning of a world where dominance depended less on what could be seen and more on what could be detected. The battlefield expanded into invisible spaces, electronic, informational, continuous. Night no longer paused conflict, it extended it. The lesson was subtle but permanent. Victory no longer belonged solely to those who fought bravely or maneuvered cleverly in the dark. It belonged to those who could remove darkness altogether, who could deny concealment itself. By the end of World War II, the loss of the night was complete. Fleets moved cautiously. Airspace remained contested around the clock. The idea of safety after sunset faded into memory. What radar-guided fighters revealed was not just an advantage in battle, but a transformation in how wars would be fought from that point forward. The ocean did not change, the sky did not change. But the meaning of darkness did. And once that meaning was lost, it could never be recovered.